Thank you for being here this afternoon. 16 years ago this month, a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles seared into Iraq, beginning a war that would forever change my life and the lives of so many others. I deployed the next year, a proud member of the Illinois Army National Guard, stationed in Balad, a place nicknamed Mortar-Readerville because of the constant enemy attacks, and a spot just miles away from where an RPG would tear through my Black Hawk helicopter that November. I probably should have died that day. I still remember the light rain coming down that morning, and I still remember the rare treat of a milkshake in the green zone that I'd had that afternoon. But most of all, I remember the scorching heat and deafening roar of the blast that cost me both my legs and nearly my life as well. The only reason I didn't bleed out on that dusty battlefield was the heroism of the troops around me. My buddies didn't know if I was alive or dead, but they lived every word of the soldier's creed, refusing to leave me behind, even risking their own lives in the process. So from the moment I woke up in Walter Reed 11 days later, I vowed to spend my life trying to repay the troops who saved me that afternoon. I can't fly combat missions anymore, or be the one to drag them out of a burning Black Hawk if the worst should ever happen again. But what I can do is use my new role, serving, no longer from the pilot's seat, but from my seat on the Armed Services Committee, to make sure that the armed forces that I love are the strongest that they can be. Today, we have the greatest military on earth, but that may not be true tomorrow if we keep on the path that we've been treading. The National Defense Strategy rightly points out the need to prepare for great power competition with China and Russia, and I support the NDS call for investing in hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, and a future vertical lift program. Congress must also prioritize significant investments in our military's logistics systems and mobility capabilities. We pour roughly $600 billion into defense annually. This week, the administration asked to set aside more than $700 billion for defense in next year's budget alone. And Pentagon spending already accounts for more than half of the discretionary federal budget. But just funneling money into the DoD's budget is not enough. If we want to win tomorrow's wars, we have to reject yesterday's oversimplified view of what constitutes national strength. For far too long, we've measured the might of our military by the size of our arsenal. And in doing so, we've made the flawed assumption that our decades of dominance on the global stage can predict our future place in the world. But ISIS doesn't care that we stormed the beaches of Normandy. Russia isn't giving us points because once upon a time we outraced them to the moon. And China doesn't give a damn what we did during Desert Storm. We will lose ground, literally and figuratively, if we sit back and assume that last century's tactics will win us next decade's wars. If we believe that 2030's battles will be decided solely by how much money we spend on fighter jets or on ships. You know, I come from a long line of veterans who've served this country in uniform since before Washington crossed the Delaware, and I myself spent 23 years in the military. I will always, always make sure that our troops have every dollar, every weapon that they need to bring down the bad guys. But despite what the president proposed this week, we can't just keep throwing together huge defense budgets every year and think that that's enough. No. Instead, we need a platform that balances investing in our weaponry with investing in our citizenry, in investing in our economy, rejecting the false choice between looking out for our troops overseas and caring for our families here at home. It's not either or, it's both and. Our power abroad stems from our strength here on U.S. soil. So it's past time that we recognize that funding our domestic priorities actually bolsters our national security. Because at this point, refusing to invest in our schools or our healthcare system in the name of national strength isn't just cruel, it's short-sighted. Recently, for example, the Pentagon announced that only 29% of Americans between the ages of 17 and 24 are considered fit to serve. Just 29%. The other 71% either failed the basic math or English tests, could not pass a physical, or were barred from enlisting because they made a mistake years ago that still lies on their record, like getting caught with marijuana in a state where it's now legal, or one struggling with an opioid addiction. Meanwhile, the Army fell short of its recruiting goal last year for the first time since the height of the Iraq War. So I'm not pushing for more funding for pre-K or mental health care just because they're progressive priorities, or even because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing so because I love our country, because I want our armed forces to remain the strongest in the world, and we don't stand a chance of dominating militarily if 3/4 of our would-be recruits can't even get to basic training. I'm doing so because our place on top of the global order is contingent on us taking up the domestic policies that all too often is seen as in opposition to our defense priorities. If we don't, well, then we're just going to be letting our dwindling recruiting pool shrink even faster, ceding our place in the world to bad actors like Russia and China in the process. There are easy, obvious ways to expand that pool, policies that show both common sense and common decency. When I was bleeding out in that Black Hawk helicopter in that dusty field in Iraq, I did not care if the troops risking their lives to save me were gay, straight, transgender, black, white, male, or female. All that mattered was that they did not leave me behind. If you're willing to put your life on the line for this country and you can do the job, you should be able to serve, no matter how you identify or whether you were born on U.S. soil. Since freed slaves put on the uniform of the nation that had kept them in chains, since Japanese Americans fought for this country even while their families sat trapped in internment camps here at home, since women refused to be grounded, smashing through glass ceilings to fly more than 10,000 feet in the air to help topple the Nazis, and since Perry Watkins stood in camouflage as a proud gay man refusing to be forced out of service because of who he loved, our differences have made us a more effective fighting force. Scientific research and four-star generals will tell you the same thing. When everyone looks and acts and thinks the same, you become stuck, flat-footed, insular. Diversity leads to more creative problem solving and more success. It's a better expression of who we are as a country. It also makes us better able to execute missions downrange. With fewer people enlisting as the years go on, we should be celebrating every person who serves. We should be honoring those immigrants who can't even vote yet, but who love this country so much they're willing to put on her uniform and die for it. But instead, we're turning them away, kicking them out, deporting people like Miguel Perez Jr., who went to Afghanistan to defend his nation, then was tossed aside when he got back home and deported to Mexico, where he's now homeless and penniless. Look, I know that some people in power never deigned to put on the uniform, but bone spurs did not stop me from serving. So let me be clear. Let me say something for those folks. Our military is the greatest in the world. It is the greatest the world has ever seen, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. Bigotry has no place downrange, and winnowing our military in this way weakens our forces and endangers our country. So step one is simple. Stop discriminating against people who can do the job. Step two, begin tackling the systematic issues that are robbing us of so many would-be recruits. How do we expect to win the wars and to come if more and more Americans are too sick or have fallen too far behind in school to enlist? We can't. We will lose our place in the world if we don't do the work today to ensure as many people as possible can wear the uniform tomorrow. And that starts with addressing the fact that half of young Americans are considered too unhealthy to serve. Some suffer from asthma or are hard of hearing, while 27% are deemed too overweight to enlist. And these numbers are only supposed to balloon in the years to come. So let's be brutally honest. The recent attempts to strip away health care from millions were cruel enough, but they were also hypocritical. Every time our government makes it harder for an American to get health care, they are sapping the military's potential strength, robbing it of potential privates or second lieutenants, even while claiming we need to spend more money making our armed forces more powerful. There are fixes here that should not be considered partisan, like putting more money into schools' fitness programs, or initiatives like the National School Lunch Program, which has led to a 23% spike in fruit eating among kids, something that, as a mother of a 4-year-old, I can tell you is quite a feat. Or making sure that every child in every classroom in America has access to mental health care. Or guaranteeing that every parent can afford basic checkups for their toddlers. Or I don't know, maybe just maybe those in power should stop trying to take away Americans' health care in the middle of the night. Listen, the military already pours more than $1.5 billion a year into treating obesity-related medical conditions, discharging those too unhealthy to serve, and replacing those discharged with new recruits who have to be trained from scratch, spending more training dollars. So no one can claim to care about military spending or readiness if they don't support the common sense healthcare policies that would actually get our forces into better fighting shape and save us money in the process. It's a similar story when it comes to education. There's something wrong when a third of potential recruits can't serve because they either failed the military's entrance exam or never earned a high school diploma or GED. That figure is shocking, but not surprising, reflecting the larger reality that half of US adults can't read a book at an 8th grade level. But here too, there are concrete ways that we can solve the problem. Research has proven that early childhood learning directly affects long-term development, with studies showing that at-risk kids who attend good preschools are 44% more likely to graduate high school. In 2015, a Pentagon study reviewed that $125 billion of its budget was lost to bureaucratic waste. Another $100 million, partially paid for by your tax dollars, went straight into the wallets of just 5 civilian contracting firm CEOs. Imagine how many more kids would graduated if we had invested some of that $250 billion worth of money in Chicago's public schools or Head Start programs instead. And if we don't make these investments, if we keep letting our schools slide and our students suffer, imagine how many would-be Green Berets or Marines we'd be losing. If we don't start to better invest in our kids, we might lose out on that next Black Hawk helicopter pilot brave enough to risk their life to put an injured buddy out of their helicopter, or the next Navy admiral who otherwise may have led the raid to capture the next Osama bin Laden. It's never been a choice between schools and national security, despite what some might suggest as they tried to slash billions from the education budget last year, or to try to redirect some cash for some made-up emergency at the border. Just investing in future vertical lift aircraft is a much-needed investment in our Army. So too is investing in the child who could be capable of flying that helicopter one day. So too is funding for the STEM programs that ensure that folks in the private sector as well will have the skills they need to develop the next generation of weapons platforms. Because it's not just about investing in human capital. We can't sit on the sidelines as our adversaries lead the way, developing the tech that will decide the global power order in the years to come. As China is investing to win the next space race and Russia skates past us in quantum computing, and we're putting our troops in danger of losing those battles if we don't invest in technologies that will help us compete in this century's battlefields, whether that's a stretch of sand in Southwest Asia or a piece of code that holds up our electrical grid. Technology like AI and hypersonics and future vertical lift and supercomputers, all of which would determine our standing in the world, all of which Americans could learn to develop if we had better STEM funding and more need-based grant programs. Because it's absurd right now that foreign students, many funded by their governments, are being sent to the US to gain the training to build these next-gen weapons at our universities, and then they take that learning and go back overseas. All the while, too many Americans can't even afford to send their kids to those colleges with the same education. DARPA invented the internet a half a century ago. There's no reason our nation should not continue to lead this field in another half century from now. Of course, not all the biggest threats over the next 50 years will take the shape of a missile attack or a computer hack. No matter how many people put their heads in the sand and refuse to acknowledge basic facts, the horrifying truth is that climate change is real, and climate change is here. Antarctica is melting, and California is burning, the Maldives are sinking, and temperatures are climbing. This is not a partisan squabble. It's a national and global security threat, something that military leaders and this administration's own intelligence officials admit, as terrorist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram use drought to solidify their power in Syria and Nigeria. As high tides flood our Coast Guard stations and rising sea levels threaten to swallow 100 of our own military bases. Tell me that won't impact troop readiness. There are no shades of gray here. We need to take action to curb climate change before it is too late. One way to do so is to pivot the military further away from fossil fuel, investing in green energy instead. Even staunch Republicans like former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis have spent years pushing for this, not just because it's It would slash pollutants, not because it's cheaper, not because it reduces our dependence on foreign oil and cuts our ties to oil-rich bad actors like Saudi Arabia, but because it's proven time and again to save troops' lives. Don't take my word for it. Listen to General Mattis, who all but begged the military to untether itself from fossil fuel since militants led a major assault on a diesel convoy in 2003. Why? Because fuel supply convoys make for easy, predictable targets. In Afghanistan in 2007, 1 of every 24 fuel convoys suffered casualties. Even George W. Bush agreed, setting renewable energy benchmarks for our military to reach, benchmark that became ambitious under Obama. And in the years since, we've learned that this policy works. Green energy keeps our troops safer, and efficient fuel use slashes their numbers of refueling stops. Mobile solar panels enable troops to turn off generators, helping them move through enemy territory unheard and undetected. And low-weight, longer-lasting batteries lighten troops' packs, meaning they can carry more bullets on their backs instead. As one former Navy captain put it, years ago, the belief was you could either be efficient or a capable warfighter. Now we've found that they are interdependent. By being more efficient, you become a better warfighter, end quote. In other words, in every dollar that we invest in green energy, our military gets stronger. Finally, if we want to keep leading on the world stage, we need to reflect on the fact that most of this country has simply accepted, no, they've seemingly forgotten that we're still in the thick of 2 wars. We need to think about how casually we're shipping teenagers off to Iraq and Afghanistan. Then we have to question why the hell we're asking them to die 6,000 miles from home when we don't even know why they're still there, when we can't even verbalize their mission or visualize the end state. Last year, Americans who were not even alive when the Twin Towers fell became eligible to enlist. 18-year-olds who've grown up knowing nothing but a nation at war, who weren't yet born when we first airlifted special forces into Afghanistan, were sent into the sandbox themselves. Most people run away from battle, but our service members run towards it. They watch their brothers and sisters in arms die. They miss births and funerals, school plays and college graduations. Then they come home bearing the wounds of war, both visible and otherwise. They will always do their job defending our country, no matter the sacrifice. So they deserve to know that they have the moral support and the legal backing of this great nation. But more than 15 years now, Washington has failed to give them even that. One of Congress's most solemn duties is deciding when and how we send Americans into combat by debating and passing an authorization for use of military force to set the legal framework and constitutional basis for military action, and we are supposed to define the mission of Americans downrange. But lately, too many on the Hill have shrugged off that duty, hiding behind the outdated AUMFs that launched Afghanistan and Iraq wars all the way back in 2001 and 2002. They're scared of political risks that come with bringing these wars back into the spotlight. Staring down election days, Congress has shirked its responsibilities to our troops. These documents have been used to justify nearly 2 decades of war and the deaths of thousands of American heroes. But they've been rendered meaningless as those in power have stretched and skewed their original intent, leaving our troops without a clearly defined mission, shadowboxing an ill-defined enemy everywhere from Niger to Iraq. Enough. Enough of being more worried about political consequences than about our troops in harm's way. Enough of watching on as another wife learns she'll never see her husband again, as another father is forced to bury his daughter in Section 60 at Arlington. Until we muster up the courage to ask and answer the tough questions that will actually tell our troops what they're fighting for, we won't be living up to their sacrifices. Instead, we will be leaving them in an endless loop, refusing to even look for an off-ramp. Look, I have friends from the Illinois National Guard who are in Afghanistan right now, buddies who I served with in Iraq 15 years ago. These are guys who've done 7, 8 rotations, who go in knowing they'll probably be back on that same stretch of sand in a couple of years, fighting for that same patch of desert all over again. They gain a few feet one tour, they lose an inch or two the next. They watch their buddies bleed, die over the same piece of ground, time after time, deployment after deployment. Yet lately, we've somehow spent more time debating whether athletes should kneel during the national anthem or if they're disrespecting our troops than we have discussing what our troops actually need. It shouldn't be this hard. Anyone who claims the mantle of patriotism can't keep demanding such sacrifice from our service members while refusing to have this debate. After all, how can we expect Americans to keep re-enlisting or to sign up for the first time if we can't even imagine the end state they'd be dying for? Our already narrowing military population will continue to contract, leaving us with too few people to bear too heavy a burden. So right now, we're at a breaking point. We can no longer keep to yesterday's definition of national strength, one where our might of our military is measured by the numbers of commas in our defense budget, and where our love for this country is judged by how loudly we sing the national anthem. Because unless our citizenry is strong, our weaponry and pageantry won't matter. Unless our 8th graders can read and our families have health care, unless our troops have the latest tech and our bases are not flooded, unless everyone who wants and is fit to serve can put on the uniform, our forces will be at a disadvantage. And that's before they even reach the battlefield. There's no real choice between caring for our troops and caring about our classrooms. There's no choice between being a defense hawk and believing in progressive policies. There's no real choice between loving our military and wanting to make it better. In fact, working to improve our military is exactly what has allowed it to be so great for so long. This nation was founded on the notion of a more perfect union. It was built on the idea that we can always do better, never achieving perfection, but always striving to climb a little higher than the day before. To me, that's true patriotism, the kind that goes beyond just giving our service members a discount at the ballpark, the kind of patriotism they actually deserve. Because I know these troops, I fought with these troops. I would have died if these troops, and some of them, I would have died for so many of these troops, and some of them very nearly died for me. They're heroes who lose an arm, yet umpteen surgery later, somehow find their way back to the battlefield, refusing to stop serving their country. They're new parents who miss their little girl's first word or their little boy's first steps because they've put country over self, walking back into harm's way just weeks after their children were born. They stand on their front porches and kiss their loved ones goodbye so our loved ones can sleep a little better at night, redefining bravery with every action they take. We'll never be able to fully repay the debt we owe them, but it's on us to try. That's exactly what I've tried to do from the first moment I woke up at Walter Reed, and that's what I plan to do every day I'm lucky enough to work in the Capitol and sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Tour after tour, time after time, our troops risk everything to fight for the rest of us. So starting today, I hope the American people will join me in vowing to do everything we can to fight for them, to serve them too. Thank you.